I think we have about quorum. This is about a third of the folks that have RSVP'd. And Howard, I also want to say I love your comments as people are filling out where they're from. It's like live commentary of like Charm City. Nice. All right. Welcome everyone to the first Machine Learning UX meetup of 2022. Woohoo! So today we're going to get started. I'm going to give a little bit of background for those of you. It's awesome to see so many folks that this is your first Machine Learning UX meetup here. Welcome. We're so excited to have you. And I won't take up too much time because the real reason we all came is to hear from Howard, who's going to give a talk about designing for equitable AI futures. But don't worry, if you have questions, start thinking of them now, get them ready, put them in chat, and we'll ask Howard them all at the end. So yeah, let us get started. Awesome. This is us today, designing for equitable AI futures. I want to also just say too, I may be the one speaking right now, but there's a lot of folks behind the scenes that make this possible. So thank you to all of the other volunteers who throughout the years have made this event possible. The other thing that I wanted to chat about is some of you may be brand new to either the field of machine learning or user experience, and you might be wondering, like, UX, ML, how do these two go together? Those are two separate job categories. So how I like to think about it is, how do we use data science techniques, data analysis, machine learning methods to inform and drive UX design decisions? But also, how do we think about the inverse? How do we design around really data intensive experiences or things that are maybe algorithmically based and all the things that go with that, from user control, feedback, trust in the system, everything in between. So that's kind of what we talk about here at this meetup. In particular, I want to stress too, for those of, there might be some machine learning folks on the line who didn't introduce themselves. It's okay to ask silly questions like, what is UX? UX is short for user experience. It is a lot more than pixels on a page and colors and everything too. I would say that I'm a UXer, but my slides are in black and white. Like, you don't want me to design your app. I really think about the overall experience of a product and everything too. The other thing too, sorry to all the data science folks, but I just boiled the data into like a single word. I'm really talking about machine learning, artificial intelligence, stats, everything in between. And the reason why I'm boiling it all into one thing, I know you can fight me on like artificial intelligence is different. Yes, but to our users, it might not feel different. So that's a lot of how we think about ML and UX. Our vision as a meetup and what we do is really to create a collaborative environment between everyone who works in this domain, whether that's a PM, a UXer, a SWE, an ML engineer, ML researcher, to really come together and foster cooperation, learning across these disciplines, sharing those best practices. And we do that by hosting regular tech talks like this one that we're going to see today. We also do panels and case studies and everything too. And oh, are you coming for the first time and you're interested in more? Good news. There's a bunch of ways that you can stay in touch with us. We record these talks, like this one is being recorded today. So hello from past Michelle to you. And also we have a lot of volunteers who write up past events too. This wouldn't be possible without them. Like I mentioned, we are totally volunteer driven. So thank you to all of our volunteers who have been involved. No ML UX experience needed. But if you have a really cool domain that you work in, or like a case study or something, and you're like, hey, this would be really cool to like maybe inspire other designers, or I'm a data scientist working on chatbots, maybe doing reinforcement learning, and like, this is what I learned from doing that. Love it. Come on down. Feel free to email us. humans@mluxsf.com. I did not have the foresight that we were going to be outside of San Francisco, so there you go. But that's the domain that we have, and we would love to hear from you and really to grow this community and learn from each other. That being said, I think I mentioned this before, but we have 2 brand new Medium articles up. I want to give a big shout out to Rolly and Mina, who I believe both are on the line. Thank you so much to the both of you for writing up our best practices with LinkedIn and their straw method on how they approach more transparent user interfaces around their LinkedIn AI. And the Microsoft Hacks Toolkit, which I want to remind folks too, they actually have it open sourced. And so if you have a design you want to submit to their design library, like, go ahead, like, it's awesome. The other thing too, thank you to all the folks who donated for Feminist AI. I wanted to quickly share that if you are not aware of Feminist AI, this is our larger nonprofit. And so feel free to check them out there. And thank you to them for hosting. Okay, enough about MLUX in the background. Time to get to our tech talk. We are so excited to feature Howard Pyle. He is the founder of Experience Futures. I'm going to stop talking, and Howard, I'm just going to hand it over to you because I'm excited to hear your talk and hear about how you design for equitable AI futures.
Sure, thank you. Let me bring up my presentation. Hold on a second.
And remember,
right.
folks, feel free to put questions in the chat, and we'll have Q&A time with Howard right after.
Awesome. Okay. Can you see my screen? Everything good?
Yes, it looks great. Ooh, oceans.
Okay. So thank you. And I have to say, I have so much love and respect for Michelle and the MLUX meetup. It's the real deal. This is like it's such goodness, and it's so amazing. The content is awesome. The energy is awesome. And it's so cool that so many people are here. So I'm really, really grateful that you asked me to come and talk tonight. And so I'm gonna talk about designing for equitable AI futures and what that means. And I'm gonna start a little bit by telling you about me. So forgive me in advance, but I think it's important just to kind of give you context in terms of how I'm approaching this and where I'm coming from. So I started my career as a coder. I was in the early .com world, so I'm 150 years old. And I was in startups. I ran a digital consultancy. I ran a mobile platform. I went into the agency world, and I was head of digital for the IBM account globally at Ogilvy. I went to IBM and I ran a network of design studios. I ran developer marketing across all the business units there. And then I spent 6 years at MetLife, where I was responsible for brand design, UX, UI, front-end digital platforms, creative marketing, sponsorships, demand generation, and we relaunched the global brand in 40 markets. We relaunched all of our digital platforms, front-end digital experiences on AEM in 40 markets. And you know, I've got this experience that goes from startups to corporate life, and I got really essentially like had this real big realization about a year and a half ago, where I said, everything that we've developed, everything that we develop both in startups and in big corporations for front-end users is candidly designed for people who already know how to use digital experiences. And the way that I would articulate that is everything that we commonly publish on the front end is designed for digital privilege. And in a world where corporations are starting to think about purpose, where organizations are starting to think about how do they really double down on their social impact, DEI strategies, sustainability, what I found is that there's not a link between those ideals and what you publish in digital spaces. Candidly, there wasn't the right kind of gravity in the organizations that I was a part of for me to feel like that could happen within an organization. So I resigned and I started this organization called ExperienceFutures.org. And Experience Futures is really focused on the idea that everybody needs to have fair and equitable access to the digital tools in their lives. And I don't think we're there yet. And in a world where, because of COVID, because of digitization, because of corporate agendas, because of capitalism, et cetera, so many things are digital only now. If people don't know how to use the digital experiences in their lives, they literally lose access to the essential services. It's not a digital inconvenience. It means your grandmother can't get healthcare. It means the people down the street can't send their kids to school because they literally can't access the tools. So suddenly we're in this place where it's not just about we have our lives and then we have digital and that's all cool and all. It's no, our lives are literally dictated, and the success of our lives are dictated by whether we can navigate digital tools or not. So let me give you a couple of examples, and then I'm going to dive into how we see all of this unfolding. Rewind a year. It's COVID. People are scared. New York City was a pretty tremendous place to be during COVID. And when the vaccine came out, there was a tremendous amount of obviously like excitement, nervous energy, panic, pandemonium. This is the website that New York State published on how to find the vaccine. I am a design and UX and digital platforms expert, and this is particularly confusing to me, and then they updated it, and a year later, this is what it looks like. You have this on the left, you've got this incredibly long scroll, incredibly like when you click a site to get tested at, you get this complex kind of question and answer thing in the middle. And then the place that you selected doesn't even come up with the results for where to get tested on the right. So this is like pretty digitally horrible from a UX perspective. And this is a good example. The quote here in the center, I think, is really important. This guy in this New York Times article, the quote was, "The system is set up to be a technology race between 25-year-olds and 85-year-olds. That's not a race, that's elder neglect." So in this case, trying to get people that are the most critically, that are the most in need for COVID vaccines through these websites that just are impenetrable to them is not digital inconvenience. It's literally putting them in harm's way. So you had two things happening. You had this guy on the left here, Hugh Ma from Airbnb. He developed a site called TurboVax that sat on top of all these New York City and New York State websites for COVID vaccines and scraped the data and then actually showed people where they could get vaccines. So that's great. That's digital activism, but like it's also a statement of absolute digital failure of delivering essential services. And then you had, people on Reddit that were banding together saying, if you need help, if you can't find the vaccine, we will, we'll help you. It's like digital activism. Yes, that's awesome, but it demonstrates a fundamental failure when we have to deliver essential services through digital. Another example that came up is distance learning, right? And if you're a parent like I am, and you have a kid that's in distance learning, like it is a juggle to manage them in distance learning tools. Well, okay, in New York City, teachers were given the option to use multiple distance learning tools, which is great for the teachers. It gives them flexibility, it gives them different tools to use, except what it means for parents is that they had to log into different tools every single class, right? From literally like period one tool, period two, log on to another tool. Most of those tools that were given as options to teachers don't work on mobile devices. So right there, you have a socioeconomic divide where people that don't have laptops or desktops, computers, can't access those tools. And what would happen is that kids from lower income families, because the parents weren't able to navigate those digital interfaces, they didn't have the technology, they weren't mobile optimized. They were, you literally had situations like the one on the left where people that lived in shelters, the school district was threatening to call Child Protective Services because they were marking the kids as truant in their digital classes. So the point that I'm trying to make is that poor digital experience leads to real world consequences like never before. And one of our board members is part of the UN High Commission for Refugees. We did a talk earlier last year talking about how this affects refugees, how it affects people, stateless individuals. So this is not just a first world problem. This is around the world. This is the era that we're in. Poor digital leads to poor outcomes in your life, not just in your digital world. So that's really the foundation of the idea here. So all of that is a setup to say the digital divide includes the inability to navigate, manage, and understand experiences. When we talk about the digital divide, often academics use this term called ICTs. Do you have bandwidth? Do you have a computer? That's the first layer of the digital divide. But the second layer is, do you understand? Can you consume the content? Do you have cognitive access? And if you don't, those digital tools don't work for you. And people that don't use these tools in their day-to-day lives, they weren't trained on them. Maybe they don't have the right, interfaces at home, have a disadvantage to people who use these tools in their jobs, or were trained to use them, or have copious free time to navigate these things, or can pay for premium services, which is often more and more and more what's happening. So I talked about a couple of examples, but a couple of stats that relate to that. The NIH did a study across mobile healthcare, looking at how people respond to this shift to digitization in healthcare. And in this survey, in this panel, the study that they did, users over the age of 55 could only complete about 55% of the tasks. So what that means is that because of poor design and poor interface development, people over the age of 55 are losing access to healthcare. That's a social issue. That's not just a digital issue. 17% of US students don't have access to laptop or desktop computers. Students that live in households underneath $35,000 of average income for the household, those students don't have access to laptop or desktop computers, but financial aid tools, college applications often don't work on mobile devices, so that you have a socioeconomic divide based on digital interfaces. So we have a problem, right? Like as a designer, as a digital product developer, I'm coming to you, I'm coming to companies, I'm coming to agencies, and I'm saying we as a community have a social problem that we have to begin looking at. I think that we're at this place where digitization and the wave of digitization benefits the publishers, the organizations who are making the tools, not the users. And coming from corporate America, I can tell you that the primary metrics are cost reduction and revenue increase, right? There is not a giant sense of the social impact of the tools that we're creating. And that's something that we've got to begin looking at. I think that you have the intersection of two things. One is the social impact of design, and the other is the new platforms that are coming online, changing how interfaces are created and front end is being created, specifically automation, machine learning, AI tools. That's going to change things. And some of those things are nascent, but that's the clash. That's the intersection. And we have an opportunity as a community to shape what the future of that is. So my prediction, my kind of science fiction for you is, I think 3, 5, 7 years out, when you manage your finances, you're not going to go to a Wells Fargo experience and a Bank of America experience and an American Express experience and a credit union experience and and a Mint experience. You're going to have an interface that sits in between you and those organizations, that customizes the experience based on what you need, based on how you want to see it, based on what works for you, based on the language that works for you. That's a big shift. That's a big shift than the idea of, I work at Bank of America, I'm going to create a bespoke experience and try to capture you into Bank of America or capture you within a Google experience. We will get to a place, we need to get to a place where interfaces are created between you and the organizations that you interact with, so that you can have a successful digital life. That's awesome. That's great. That's a very rosy, optimistic view of the future, but it's fraught with peril, which we'll talk about in a second. So what I'm talking about really is the shift from what I describe as experience bias, which is one size fits all digital experiences, one app interface, one website interface that's supposed to work for everybody, right? And candidly, those interfaces are designed for people that already have a high degree of digital acumen or digital privilege. We need to shift to a place where experiences have equity baked into them. And what I mean by that specifically is that they're customized for your needs, for your abilities, for who you are. And that's the opportunity of the intersection of UX and machine learning and AI. That's the social opportunity. That's what I see coming. And I think, this shift from a single interface to an interface that is really, bespoke to the individual, it's a shift away from very Web 1.0 design principles. In Web 1.0, you got one interface that's going to work for everybody. But somehow we haven't made that shift in the design community, that the idea that interfaces can and should be different. I've had big debates with UX people where they say, well, it would work for everyone. And all these interfaces would be so much simpler if UX people just use the right patterns. That's based in the idea that there's a single pattern that works for everyone, or it's based in the idea that users have the responsibility to learn how we think patterns should work, right? And that's the problem. So I think that this gets into this question of digital literacy that comes up when you talk to NGOs or you talk to people in the government or the social impact space. And I really challenge the idea of digital literacy because it's based on the idea that users need to learn how we think and what works for the widest group of people. And your job is to learn it. It's not your job. It's our job as designers, as engineers, to customize what we're making to work for you. But that's a mental shift, and we have to make that. So I think there's already paramount examples of this out in the world right now. And if you look at demand generation, you look at e-commerce, they're already modifying experiences for individuals, and but it's for the buyer experience, right? This is a Salesforce example, right? The idea is that there's a variation of the experience. For one person, the experience is going to be optimized for price. For the other person, it's going to be optimized for rating. And there's going to be both explicit and implicit data that trains that tool to show you the right thing. But why aren't we doing that to help drive equity or to help drive inclusion or help drive understanding or social impact? That's not a conversation that we're having right now. Right. So we can imagine this in the purchase cycle, but it's hard for us to imagine in terms of social impact or the prioritization around some of these social issues that we're talking about. So part of what I see, and I think some of these are nascent, I'll be honest with you. I think some of these tools are interesting and some are not yet quite interesting. But if you look across front-end digital experiences, right, and you talk about machine learning and automation, I break it down from visual design, color type and images, UX design, navigation, user flow, information architecture, content, copy, articles, videos, et cetera, and then the front end coding. And in each of these territories, there are tool sets that are emerging, companies, programming efforts, et cetera, that are driving towards certain types of automation, right? So Canva is an example. There's other ones on the front end there's a lot of machine learning and being applied to front end design, color matching, tools to find imagery that matches a color palette. It's not a stretch to imagine machine learning creating variations of an experience or imagery based on who you are. But often, for example, imagery is picked by art directors, individuals that choose what image you see when and where. And sure, maybe there's a tool that alternates between 4 or 5 images, but I'm telling you right now, a human picks those 4 or 5 images, right? It's not a stretch to imagine those things being chosen by machine learning. UX navigation, UX patterns, et cetera. There's a lot of interesting plugins being developed around Figma. There's some interesting things happening with Adobe Sensei, with AEM Adobe Experience Manager. I think that the core UX tools actually right now are very much oriented around helping UX designers, helping the humans make their work faster. It's not a leap to begin imagining tools that will generate patterns based on what actually works for the user. That's not a stretch. It's just that our community really believes that user interfaces need to be handcrafted. I'm telling you, that's going to change. That's going to change in the next several years. Content, there's a whole tsunami of tools, that are typically built on top of GPT-3 that allow for everything from generating UI copy to generating blog posts and content. A lot of these tools, actually, it's kind of a little bit creepy. You can plug in a blog post and say, rewrite this blog post, and it's got a checker that makes sure that you're not going to get busted for plagiarism by rewriting that someone else's blog post. A lot of the content that you read online is already written by AIs, and we're not talking about it, right? And then, of course, there's stuff that's happening with, GitHub and the OpenAI Codex, and you talk to developers and, 99% of them say, like, this isn't useful. But I'm telling you, relying on GitHub for code snippets is just part of development. It's part of the dev cycle. So I think that what I'm predicting is that this is the future that's coming in terms of front-end interfaces and automation. And you have these tools that are emerging. However nascent you believe them to be, this is what's coming. And so the question about ML is, well, where exactly are you training those systems? How do you train, like AI and machine learning are not magic boxes. They don't just magically create interfaces for people. And I think one of the disconnects in the world between UX and design and dev and machine learning and AI is that I don't think designers typically think from the perspective of data collection in order to train machine learning on interfaces. But that's happening, right? So explicit data collection on interfaces could be literally asking people questions. Right now, UX tends to do testing and research, but we don't tend to think about ongoing iterative data collection about what works for people. The implicit part of it can be the behavioral stuff. Where are you? When are you using it? We see this from a data collection and a data management perspective on the back end, but we don't necessarily think about it re-rendering interfaces for people. And so that's a shift that needs to happen. And I think there's actually a connection that needs to happen and a dialogue that needs to happen between the UX and the design community and, you know, the data scientists and the machine learning and the AI people to think about how do you design interfaces for ongoing data collection. So that's like a gap right now in my mind. So if you have this world where suddenly app interfaces, website interfaces begin to be generated through machine learning and AI, like I would call this experience automation or experience AI, right? Because it's not just design, it's not just UX, it's actually how it works, how it's organized, the content, the copy, the design, the imagery, et cetera. All those things together to me are the interface, right? The experience. I think that we're going to see more and more and more AI and machine learning there. But just as we have a risk on the left side of the screen around machine learning bias on the back end through algorithmic bias, data collection, data sampling bias, we have risk on the experience side of what are we showing to people. So imagine a world where machine learning is showing you things that it thinks you need or will work for you. What is it not showing to you? Where is it leading you to? How is it inheriting bias from those back-end systems and putting it into the front end? Where is it creating more risk for you as a user? These are ethical and fundamental questions that the design community needs to talk about. And if the design community isn't talking about using machine learning, we're sure as hell not talking about what the ethics and the bias implications of using machine learning are. So that's a problem. I think there's a blinders moment that's putting the design community right in the crosshairs of a major ethical issue. So when I evaluate and when I go through with partners and we work with clients too, we do consulting to fund our nonprofit organization. When we break down experience bias, we break it down into 4 categories. We look at content and language. So does that content require special knowledge or language or abilities? We look at user interface complexity, like how hard is it for someone to navigate and move through? But then it gets a little esoteric, ecosystem complexity. So think about this. If I'm trying to manage my finances and I have 6 different websites that I have to use to manage my finances, or I'm a parent and I have to go to 6 different DOE, Department of Education sites to manage my kid in school, it's not just does this one website test well for the users, it's what am I trying to do as a human? What's the job I'm trying to accomplish? And do all the tools work together? And I'll tell you, every corporation, every business, every web publisher, every app publisher says, how it works across an ecosystem is not my business. Well, my business is how it works on my site. And I'm telling you, for the humans, this problem is a big thing. And everyone's saying, not my issue, right? So how do we as a community make that our issue, right? One version says we standardize on design patterns. We standardize on the way things work. The login's always on the upper right, really small now. We all use hamburger menus, whatever. That to me gets back to we have a way of working that the users have to learn. I think this issue is going to be solved through more customization, right? But that's a future issue. And then the final piece of experience bias is this thing I was describing, where if your design, if your UX, if your content is generated by machine learning and AI, are we inheriting bias from those systems? If I'm using a tool to generate copy and content and bring that into my front-end experiences, what are the bias prevention mechanisms built into that AI content generation tool? And do I even care? Am I looking at that? I don't think people are, right? So it's not just a matter of looking at the ethics and the bias of the data systems in the background. We have to be ethical users of these machine learning tools. And that's part of this whole AI ethics conversation that I think we need to do more of. So, okay, so some unsolicited advice, right? And it's a really interesting, diverse group on this call. But for if you're an executive, if you're a founder, if you're a senior leader at an organization, right? So I was a senior leader at MetLife. I was a senior vice president, and my job was to deliver front-end experiences that met business goals. But I didn't believe that the front-end experiences that we were creating matched our sustainability goals, our DEI goals, our social impact goals. So question number one for leaders is, do you have a digital equity and an experience strategy that matches your social impact goals? Can you describe how you're going to deliver against those goals in digital spaces? I have not heard an answer to that question at almost every organization that I've been a part of. That's a big deal. The second thing is, as a leader, are you genuinely helping your design and UX teams hire talent that represent your diverse users? Are you giving them the incentives and the tools to do that, right? That's actually starts at the leadership level. When you get all the way down to the design or the programming or the dev teams, like, it's much harder. You have to actually make that happen at the leadership level. For strategy and research people, are you designing and defining research targets based on those digital equity strategies that the company is describing? If the company can't tell you what their prioritization is for diverse users in digital spaces, you're probably not designing research targets against those users, and you're probably not testing against those users. So how can you test against a set of targets that have not been designed or approved? Typically what leaders say is, this is my most profitable user. This is what I want you to design against. And things like ADA are, yeah, try to make it ADA compliant if you can, but we need to figure out how to bake that into the strategy and the research process. And so how do you think about inclusion, not just about disability, but about age, economic status, gender, identity, race? How do you make sure those things are part of your research and your testing? And so then for design and creatives, my big push, my big belief is that we need to get to a place where we're designing and launching multiple interfaces based on individual need. That's a seismic shift in how design is created right now. The 80-20 rule is dead, right? We need to get to a place where we're designing for individual need, right? So that means more design capacity. It means more funding. It means more tools. It means we're going to have to embrace automation to make this work, right? So that's where I think the advice is, work with your devs to use ML to drive iteration, right? That's a real live use case. It's a real live opportunity. And then for devs and tech teams, invest in tech that drives iteration in the front end, right? I see a lot of experience AI equals a chatbot. Well, yeah, that's one slice of it. Sure. But how can you think about helping your design teams to think about ML to drive iteration in the experience patterns, in design, in content? How can you be a participant and a partner? And how can you help UX teams move past the idea that there's one interface, right? So that needs to be a partnership and a dialogue between tech and design. So this community is ground zero for this issue, in my opinion, right? And so final thought, 3 questions you should ask every CEO. You should probably ask your CEO is, do you have a digital and experience equity strategy based on your DEI, sustainability, and social impact goals? That's a really simple question. I doubt they will say yes. I doubt they will even know how to answer that question. And so I think that's a pressure that needs to be put on the C-suite in every organization. The second is, are you creating multiple variations of front-end experiences based on the needs of users? and based on those diverse and inclusive goals. Most organizations create one interface. They create one set of content and they expect people to learn it. And the final one is, are your machine learning and AI platforms learning from experiences and experience preferences to improve digital equity? Like, explicitly, are you trying to deliver against social impact goals by the way you're rendering personalization through machine learning? And suddenly the CIOs, the tech leads, have a direct role in social impact, in DEI, in purpose, right? So this is a really big, it's an interesting territory for tech. Tech has an opportunity to weigh in and be a part of social change within organizations like never before on the front end. And it's not just these esoteric back-end conversations around AI ethics. So that's what I brought to you. We have a white paper that we published. You can click on the QR code. We can distribute it. Michelle, who is the most amazing promoter I've ever met in my entire life, has been tweeting samples, snippets of it. I'm Twitter, Howard Pyle. We're ExperienceFutures.org. We want to get the message out. We're a new organization. If you want us to come and talk at your event, if you want us to come and talk to your organization, if you want us to come talk to your executives or your teams, we're happy to. We're looking for people to partner with. We're looking for people to join our mission, to contribute content. Any ideas, any suggestions, if you want to be a part of this conversation, we very much want to talk to you. So Michelle, thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Oh my gosh, thank you for joining us. Thank you for the great talk. And thank you too for some of the thought starters. I'm going to take over just a little bit. And for those of you, hello, if you are new here, one of the things that we get to do is now we get to ask Howard some questions. I first want to acknowledge all the folks. I love the side chatter. I love seeing all this conversation about data and everything as well. Feel free to post any questions that you have now in the chat and I'll moderate it. So I do have a couple of questions to get us started, Howard. Thank you again for that awesome talk. I know probably when you give this talk, there's people clapping, so round of applause for you. So one of the things that I would love to dive into is I'm really impressed because you know your stuff. You have a pretty cool track record and you have done a lot. And I think it's really brave too, to kind of be like, hey, actually, I'm going to step away from that and I'm going to do what I think is right. I also think that you have a lot of really cool design leadership experience. And I'm sure there's a lot of folks on the line who are on teams at different enterprise levels. What is some kind of thoughts or advice you might have from the design teams that you've led before that you think, what are we doing right? What are some things that we can change tomorrow? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we're at a time when design and front-end experience creation and UX are under a lot of pressure. I think, most organizations are treating it like IT in the sense of they're hoping that design can happen for cheaper. And so in an era when we should be investing in more leadership, more resources, a lot of teams are cutting. So I think that's a real challenge. And I think that I noticed a question in the chat. There was this question about most design teams are under-resourced already. I think that designers need to get very smart about how their work actually delivers business value. But I think also the design community needs to sharpen their Wacom styluses into little pitchforks and say, this is important to us. We believe in social change. We believe in the social impact of what we're doing and be a voice. And I think the design community has the ability to be a voice. And so I think the advice is band together and stand up for those ideals. Understand how your interfaces are being used by people who aren't target users and champion that. Bring that data back to your leadership, right? Show them how your designs are impacting people that are outside the range of the socioeconomic targets, or are impacting diverse users. That is something that designers on design teams at organizations can take on and do, and candidly can do more and more effectively than DEI organizations or sustainability organizations, right? So how do you be a champion within your organization for the fluidity and the equity of what you're creating, right? So that would be my big piece of advice. And that's hard to do because it means being a gadfly, especially in corporate environments.
Totally. And thank you for acknowledging that it's hard to do, because it does feel scary. And I'm sure a lot of us are, maybe there's some people online, this is like their first like job in tech too. And then it's like, well, I already feel out of the box already and all this stuff too. The other thing that I might say is look around you. I really hope that MLUX does not end with this event today. I hope that you find some names and are able to connect on LinkedIn and grab coffee, or you see someone chatting. Brian, Boris, you both are very outspoken and you're able to follow up with them too. Thank you for that. Okay, I have a question from Mina. Big thanks to Mina for writing our last article. So we already see issues of equity in digital interface applications. They disproportionately affect marginalized groups. In aiming for diverse interfaces / experiences that in turn depend on AI and ML, which are known for issues of bias and fairness, how do we ensure equity? Rather, how do we mitigate AI and ML bias that exacerbating the problem?
Yeah, so I think, I think this is a really interesting question. I think that the core is defining and engaging how we would describe, how any organization would describe a diverse set of users, right? So this is why I roll it back up to the problem of, do organizations actually have a definition of digital equity based on their individual goals, right? So let's be clear. I think that Chick-fil-A is going to have a very different set of ethics than Patagonia, right? If you know anything about those brands, you'll understand why I say that. I think every organization needs to define their diverse users, who they care about. And by the way, I believe once they start doing that, consumers will begin picking more ethical companies, right? I think that's part of what's going to happen. So I think it starts up at the strategy layer to say, this is who we're defining as a priority, not just in HR, right, which is where a lot of DEI initiatives live, but into digital experiences, right? Not just sustainability from your plant or your carbon footprint, but in your digital spaces as well. How do you make it sustainable for users over time? And if the organization can begin to define those different types of users, then you can begin to build strategies into design, into tech, into physical infrastructure, into HR, yes, all those things. But I think that understanding how to move away from bias starts with knowing how to test, or who you're testing against, or what kind of bias you're testing against. And I think I'm a part of a lot of different AI ethics working groups and AI bias working groups. And I got to tell you, they go in circles quite a bit, right? Like, bias is bad, we should avoid it, we need to promote better AI. But like, there's not a discussion of what exactly is an organization trying to mitigate, and for whom that bias is an issue. So I don't think every organization can address bias en masse across the entire, interwebs. I think what we have to do is get to a place where every organization says, these are the places where we can make an impact, and bias exists in these places. Let's look at our tools. Let's look at our experiences and create tests for our organization to hit that. Because if they can't define it like that, users can't give feedback. Teams can't make mitigating efforts. And so I think it starts with getting very specific of who are we trying to serve. And I think that's the starting point of it, because without it, we can't build tests and we can't build programs to see whether or not we have bias in those systems or not.
Yeah, that's actually super interesting, because it's like, I think personally it can be a little bit overwhelming, because it's like, bias is everywhere. But I love that approach that you're proposing, which is like actually focus on the things that you are a major lever for you to make impact on. And that's a really great place to start. I want to circle back to one of the questions from Brian really fast. Brian asks, okay, so multiple design versions. That sounds super nice. In practice, though, a lot of teams I work are under-resourced to begin with. One good thing out the door is hard enough. Practically speaking, the ROI and value will have to be crystal clear to stakeholders to invest in ML-driven multi-UX investment, especially if they're not design mature to begin with. What strategies are you using or seeing to get senior executives on board with this, particularly in less design mature orgs?
Yeah, I think so we've thought a lot about this, and it comes down to two things: fear and opportunity, right? So the fear is the fear is reputational risk, right? So when we go in and we have these conversations with executives, the fear part of it is very simple. There has been a whole trend over the past 15 years of social imperatives impacting brand reputation, brand loyalty, and customer lifetime value, right? And those social things range from Me Too to BLM to, when I was at MetLife, we severed our relationships with the NRA because of the social uprising that was happening in social media, right? I predict that users will begin to rebel against organizations that don't provide digital equity. That's a thing. Like, and if you're a CEO and you have a DEI and a sustainability and a social impact goal, and you don't know how that translates into your digital experience equity strategy, I'm telling you, as a CEO, you have a risk. You should probably invest in that risk. And investing in risk to avoid reputational damage and future impact of revenue is something that CFOs understand, that CEOs understand, and CIOs understand, and candidly, chief counsels understand too. So there's already mechanisms in place in organizations to invest in those things. And the other side is the opportunity. The opportunity is future and newer markets, right? Especially Gen Y and Gen Z, make a point of buying from companies that they perceive to be ethical. And there's a lot of great studies out there that show the value of those new markets and show how much more they buy from organizations that they perceive to be ethical. And if we can begin to build a drumbeat to say, these organizations that publish one thing that works for only privileged users is not ethical, I'm telling you, people will begin to choose differently in digital spaces in terms of their products. So it's about, organizations right now invest a lot of money in agencies and experts to help them think about how to capture Gen Y and Gen Z markets. If you're saying to them that acting like an ethical company is part of capturing those markets, but you're not doing that in digital spaces, it's not just about having a website off to the side that's corporate responsibility or your social impact goals. It's like, how is it built into your product, man? How is it built into your app? How is it built into your interface? Right? That, I'm telling you, people will begin choosing companies that intentionally do that. So I am making a future prediction. And so risk and reward, that's the pitch. That's the pitch to executives.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Howard. And I think that's super interesting too, especially like in light of some of your examples, like the COVID websites and the educational websites and all that stuff too. And I am hopefully super excited about that pitch of the future, people solving this and having that more accessible. I'm going to ask a question from Angela right now. Do you think there are more optimal times to start discussing or advocating for design equity per the organization's UX maturity, i.e. if a company is still finding its product market fit, or if they're doing a poor job of designing the user groups? Like, how would you say to navigate that?
Yeah. I mean, so I think that, I guess it's like no time like the present, right? I have an organization that I'm working with that's a Fortune 100 company, and I'm helping to define a human-centered design function for them with digital equity baked into it at the center, right? And they got a long way to go. They got a lot of change they got to make. And I'm working with a startup, and I'm working with them on the MVP 0 of their entire product, right? Both of them have difficulties in what I'm proposing, right? The big organization has a difficulty because it's got a lot of institutional stuff to change. The small organization is like, we could probably only afford to build one UI, right? So how do we do all this? So, and I think there are probably companies that are at a state of mid-maturity. There are organizations I've been a part of that have a lot of money to invest in innovation, but like Brian's question, a lot of organizations don't. So I think there is probably never a good time to do this, because it means, candidly, we have to invest more. If organizations want to do better in digital equity, they have to invest more in design and change their practices and behaviors and technologies. And I think it's a different pitch for every company. So unfortunately, I don't think there's a right stage for it. I think it's just more of an imperative.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. I'm going to ask one more audience question, then I'm saving one question for the end. We have a question from Sarah. Hi, Sarah. Congratulations on your recent book. Hi, Howard. Thanks for this great talk. I'm curious about the kinds of standards Experience Futures is working on. Can you give an example of what that looks like in this space? And how are you thinking about the viability of those standards across a range of organizations? I could imagine it looks very different to implement new standards at a well-funded tech company than an under-resourced government office. Yet digital equity standards implemented by the latter would have a profound impact on access to basic rights like health, as your COVID example, or public benefits and elections. Perhaps those are still a long way from implementing for many services that use AI, but probably not that much longer. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So the simple answer is, we've looked at a lot of other social impact agendas and how standards-driven organizations can affect change. I think a great example is in the apparel world. There's this thing called the Higg Index, which is a learning model, and it's a set of questions that evaluate the efficacy and the sustainability and the environmental impact across apparel manufacturing, from sourcing to manufacturing to distribution to sales. And it's not a standard meaning like you have to achieve this metric. It's a set of common questions that are part of a process to create a score, to create a question and an answer cycle about where is an organization. So the standards could be more about evaluation, and it actually matches the kind of questions I was asking in my provocations. It starts with business strategy, DE impact linked to sustainability and digital goals, right? Like, do those exist, right? That's a question. So the standard can simply be a standardized set of questions. Do you have diverse people on your teams? Yes or no? Do you have multiple variations of experiences that you're creating? Yes or no? So the standard is really going to be about a process model across the organization, as opposed to design standards or technical standards. And candidly, I wish we could just focus on creating optimal digital outcomes just by designing more stuff. But unfortunately, it means getting involved with how organizations work. So the standards are really about process, and it's a process model of standards more than it is a scoring model of standards.
I see. Okay, that's super interesting too. I feel like I've had a bunch of little epiphanies during your talk about reframing how I think about these problems, and I'm very excited about marinating on this some more. Awesome. So I have one final question for you. You have a captive audience of UXers, data scientists, SWEs, PMs here in the room. What would be one piece of advice or guidance that you want us to do, like implement tomorrow at our job?
I would say I would roll it back up to that question of, look at your company, look at what your company claims to care about. I mean, I'm assuming that a lot of people here actually work in the private sector. I think it's a different topic if you're, talking to NGOs. Look at what your company claims to care about. And I'm not saying they don't. Look at the social impact, look at the DEI, look at the purpose. How are you being empowered to manifest that in your digital tools, in your digital experiences? And I think what I would bring back is begin questioning that. Ask why, ask where that exists. And those sort of prompts, those sort of provocations, there's typically not going to be an answer to. And I think by asking, we used to have an old kind of axiom in my team, which was, if you ask a question, you're on the hook to try to answer it, right? So you're empowering yourself and your organization by demanding an answer to that question. And I think that's a question that you can ask non-technical people and executives too.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much. I also want to share too that Kathy Baxter also shared the community juries from Microsoft too. Definitely going to take a look into that too. But thank you so much for such a great talk, and thank you for sharing your insights with us. I know time flies when we do these events, especially virtually now. Just to quickly wrap up, big thanks to Feminist AI, our larger nonprofit. So thank you to everyone who donated. It goes back to supporting our community space there. And big round of applause to Howard. Thank you, all of you, for joining tonight too, because we wouldn't be hosting these events. It would just be like me and Howard just like chatting for coffee, and I would have learned a lot. But I'm really happy that so many folks are able to join too. So thank you so much. And we'll hang out on the line for another 5 minutes if you want to share a little bit about yourself. Howard, maybe you have to stop the recording and stuff too.
Oh yeah, maybe I do.
And we can stop the recording. And if you just want to chit chat or pitch a project or anything too. Awesome. Thanks, Boris, and your little Maryland